Well, so you can imagine when Baha'u'llah said no, he will not go, that he was a prisoner in that house. Abdul Baha could not insist. He could not say any more. But then he decided he better get somebody who is not a believer. He could insist. And so he went along and he saw the Mufti of Akka, which is the religious head of the city. And he was one of those great admirers of Baha'u'llah, this Mufti. A man by the name of Miri, he was Ali Miri. He was a very devoted person. He was really devoted to Baha'u'llah. Wasn't only an admirer, but he really became a worshipper, you can say, of Baha'u'llah. He had seen so many miracles, really, that man, in his life during that short period that Baha'u'llah was in Akka. That he once came to Abdul Baha and he said to Abdul Baha, he said, every time I stand to pray, Baha'u'llah appears in front of me. I pray to him. You see, this is how the influence of the power of God can change the hearts of people. And at first he was a great, I wouldn't say enemy, but he was a very difficult person. He was very much against the faith and the founder of the faith. And he met Baha'u'llah in the barracks of Akka, this man. And he was so proud that Abdul Baha kept on reminding him when he went to the presence of Baha'u'llah that he must change his attitude. And if ever he wanted to say anything, if this man wanted to say anything in the presence of Baha'u'llah, Abdul Baha would say, be quiet, don't say anything. You know, this is how he really enabled him to see gradually the greatness and the power of the faith. And then came a time that this Mufti of Akka became such an admirer of Abdul Baha that if he ever walked with him, he always walked behind the master, which is a very important sign in the East. If you walk with somebody, it depends who you are and who he is. If he is more important than you, you never walk in front of him. You always stay a step behind. And he always walked behind the master. And anyhow, this man came to Baha'u'llah and he said that, why aren't you going to this house outside Akka? And Baha'u'llah said to him that he was a prisoner. He would not go. And he said, he insisted. And he said, everything is ready. You are not a prisoner. No one can keep you a prisoner. And remember, the edict of the Sultan was still in force. The edict of the Sultan was still in force. But, and he said he will not leave Baha'u'llah. He just kept on, he clung to the hem of Baha'u'llah's garment and he knelt before him. And he said, not until he accepts this leaving the house will he leave him. And so Baha'u'llah said, okay. And then, as you know, he went to the mansion of Mazra'e for the first time. And he went in that carriage. And Abdul Baha says, I took him there and I returned back to Akka myself. And so Baha'u'llah then spent mostly the months of summer and the months of when the weather was not very cold, in the springtime, sometime in the autumn, he spent in that house. But he often came back to Akka. You mustn't think that when he went into that house that he never came back. Oh no, he came back many a time to Akka. And after all, Abdul Baha was living in the house of Abud. The mother of Abdul Baha was living there. And the greatest holy leaf was living there at the time. And so he often came to the house of Abud. And then, as you know, this mansion of Bahji came into the picture. The mansion of Bahji was completed by the same man who owned the house, part of the house of Abud, a man called Udi Khammar. he completely finished. It was half-built building. Udi Khammar, he finished it and he made it a residence for himself. He wanted to move into this great palace in the outside of Akka. But as you know the details, how the outbreak of cholera took place and how Abdul Baha went along and rented that from him. And Baha'u'llah then moved into that. Now when he moved, he really did not move from the mansion of Mazra'ah into the mansion of Bahji. It happened that he was in Akka. When he left for the mansion of Bahji, he left Akka from the house of Abud to the mansion of Bahji. And it was just at the time that my father was in the presence of Baha'u'llah at that time as a pilgrim. And he said that when this building was rented by Abdul Baha, the believers went there along with Abdul Baha and they washed the building with soap and water and everything else, because it is a marble building in the top part of it, and they washed it all and cleaned it for the coming that Baha'u'llah will come into it. And the first people who moved in were the family of Baha'u'llah, but not the mother of Abdul Baha or the greatest holy leaf or Abdul Baha himself. They did not move. And the reasons for it, now we don't go into it. Then one day it was known that Baha'u'llah is going to move to that mansion. And as you know, Akka in those days did not have any public lighting. The whole area was in the dark at night, absolutely dark. But some Baha'is of India had sent to Baha'u'llah a very unusually large lamp, oil lamp, oil, the wick, the oil. And this lamp was brought into the mansion and it was put in the hall, and you could see it from distance, a light shining in the mansion. So now this is the background to it. So one day Baha'u'llah was to go and move to this mansion. And my father and Nabil, both of them, were living in a little room in one of the streets of Akka. The street of Akka, called as Suq Abiyaz, means the white market. And when you live in that place, they had a window which was overlooking the road. And the only way that someone can come from the house of Abu to go into to go through the gate and go out of Akka is to pass in front of that house. And so they were standing behind the window, waiting just for a time that Baha'u'llah would be passing in front of their house, in front of their room. And they waited and waited until near sunset, before sunset. And then suddenly they saw that Baha'u'llah was then riding a donkey. It was very custom. This was the only way in those days. It was not the carriage, just a donkey. And behind was Baha'u'llah's servant, about 10 yards behind him. He was riding on his donkey. And the two passed in front of this room. And as soon as it passed and they saw him, Nabil said, "Let us go and follow them." So the two of them came out and they walked behind about 200 yards away, following Baha'u'llah. And when they reached the gates of the city, the guards showed their respects to Baha'u'llah, and he went out, and these two also went out afterwards. And soon it became dark, evidently, and then they could see, eventually they reached the point that they could see the light in the mansion. Ground for their cattle to eat. And one man went up one of these very tall trees, very, very tall. And when he went very, very tall, up and went to the very top of it, suddenly he slipped a little bit and he fell down. Very high up, and he knew he's going to be killed. There's no question about it, falling from that height. At that moment, in desperation, in a fraction, in all this thing coming in a split second, he turned to God and he said, if you save me, I'll give all my cattle to you. All that I have, and that's all he had. All my cattle to you, for you. I don't want them. Please save me. And of course God heard him, and he said, okay, we will see what he will test him. See, God always tests. He, instead of falling down on the ground, he fell on another branch. And he just hardly held himself. But it was, when he looked down, it was again dangerous. But it wasn't as dangerous as before. He was further down. So he again began to pray, please save me from here, he said. But he said, last time, when I was on the top of the tree, I said, I'll give all my cattle to you. I think it's not fair, he said, that I should give all my cattle to you. Really and truly, I think half of the cattle for you. And after all, I have a wife and family and children. You don't, what will you do with all the cattle anyhow? I'll keep half of it, and the other, you save me. I'll keep the half, and then you keep the other half. So God said, okay, we'll let him go down a little bit more. So this time he fell down, and he came down and he landed on another branch, which wasn't at all as high as the previous one. But still, he saw now if he falls down, he's not going to be killed. That's the danger of death is gone. So he said, really God, I was becoming very sentimental and carried away. I was really carried away. I think this is altogether an unfair situation. I mean, what will you do with... I have a wife, I have children, I've lived all these years, I've gathered these cattle, and now give you half of it. Really, what will you do with the half? Really, that's unfair. I was carried away, he said, when I was up there. I'll make a deal with you, he said. I'll have all the cattle, and you have all the milk and the cream. So God said, okay, that's all right. Fair enough. And he let him drop down to the ground. And when he dropped down to the ground, he said to himself, what milk, what butter, oh no, you don't want it. Really, this was all unusual excitement on my part. You don't need it. Now you see, I said the story that now at this time in the history of mankind, we are now on the ground. Our foot is on the ground and we are safe. But a time will come, I can assure you, that we will be on the top. And then we are ready to give everything. And then it may not be just work out for us. This is what happened in Persia. Because the world conditions will really dramatically change. We talked, the world conditions will deteriorate with such speed now that it is going to bring about what Baha'u'llah has foreshadowed. The limbs of mankind to quake. Shoghi Effendi mentions, he says, the cities will burn. The atmosphere of the earth will be contaminated. And he said these are only either accompanying or will herald the coming of that great calamity which mankind must go through. He has written this. So that it is our really work and our privilege now to arise and serve the cause of God. And be sure of His assistance. He'll come to us if our motive is right. Well, I feel that you've had plenty of... you got tired. And we can go out, Mr. Chairman, have a cup of tea, and then we can come back again. But this time I will certainly deal with all the questions that you have left. I have them all in here. All right. Well, I am going to look at something which is... I suddenly thought of a little story, I'll tell you. Because it's a good thing to know how this is to do with this. Because somebody was mentioning to me during the break that gave me to... I felt that people think that to serve the faith, it means that you have to do something very, very big. All the big noises, join the big noise people like myself, for instance, which is not really serving the faith at all in relation to what other people can do. I can tell you that. Talking is nothing to do with the faith, with serving the faith. It could do something, but I feel that we must not think that to serve the faith you have to be responsible for a certain function, or you must be a person who yes, is a member of an assembly or a national assembly or a board member or anything like that. This has nothing to do with service to the faith. And another thing that I want to mention is that how much in the next life we will be amazed to find out that so many unknown people in this life, unknown in the way of public, not being in the public attention or public eye, who will have such an exalted station in the spiritual worlds of God. And how many people like me who will be completely lost. Now, you know, this is true. This is really true. We must not ever attach importance to this, the people having a position, because nobody, as I said, has a station in this faith, really. We are all having a function. Yes, we have sacred functions. But this function is given, and God help the person who has been given a function. If he doesn't do his function well, it's much better if he was not given this function. You know, because service to the cause is when you make a cup of tea in your home with the love in your heart that you want the people to come into your home so that they could hear about the faith. That service, if it is done with the purity of motive, which is you do it for the love of God and for the love of Baha'u'llah and for the love of the people, that's much more meritorious than anything else, because God does not want from us more than we can do. But He wants us to do our best. It doesn't matter what we do. And in fact, the simpler one is, the better it is. The simple heart, the simple person. We have lost, I think, our simplicity in this modern civilization. If a soul is simple, God loves that simple soul. Always the simple soul has got he is the one who is going to benefit, and he'll receive all the rewards, because there's nothing worse than becoming sophisticated with modern way of life. And this modern way of life has really destroyed, most peoples of the world have been destroyed as a result of this modern civilization, which is eventually going to be destroyed and perished. The civilization that we have, it's a tottering civilization that Shoghi Effendi refers to it. So that, you know, we must not pay attention to these outward appearances of peoples and what they do. What is important to God is the heart of person and how you feel. And what little you think, the big things other people do and the big projects other people have and all the things they do, if it is not done to the best of their knowledge and ability. Now, the story which came to me is a story, I'll tell you two similar stories really. One is during this period of Shoghi Effendi. I knew a man who was called Charles Dunning. I don't think any of you had met him. He was an Englishman. He was a man from Yorkshire. Some of you could read his account of his life in the Baha'i World, one of the volumes of the Baha'i World, in the memoriam. He was illiterate. He hardly could write his name. He was if you looked at him, I don't want to describe it, what it was like physically. This man had such a pure heart and so frank, and none of these conventions that we are familiar with, none of these conventions he ever understood or carried it out. And yet he was the beloved of Shoghi Effendi. Shoghi Effendi loved him so much, and he showered so much love upon him. Someone arranged for him to go. He was one of the Knights of Baha'u'llah. He went to the islands, the Orkney Islands, in the north of Scotland. And he taught the faith. He left behind him so much memories. But he was very frank, and the language wasn't what you would expect from a Baha'i sometimes. But this didn't mean anything, because the language which came out of him was purely from a very pure heart. When he went to see Shoghi Effendi, when he went on pilgrimage, I'll just give you an example of the language. Shoghi Effendi so much loved this person, he always made him to sit at his right hand side at the table. He used to call Shoghi Effendi, who said, "Guardian, this is not right," he said. This is how he would talk to the guardian. "What you said is not right." He just had this. And once Shoghi Effendi said to him, "I have given some more plans to the British Baha'is. They are not going to like it." He said, "You are talking rubbish." Now, this is the man. He didn't say rubbish. There was a slang which means rubbish. He says bunkum. Bunkum, guardian. And he didn't understand what bunkum means, and it meant rubbish. You're talking rubbish. Now I think, but now the love that Shoghi Effendi had for him had no bounds really. And he was such a simple man that he used to sign his name. He could only write his name, Charles Dunning. He would write down there KB after his name, means Knight of Baha'u'llah. The British people who are knighted, they are usually called KBE. They write down after name. These are the titles. And he always used to write his name, Charles Dunning KB. Well, it was always the same thing. Abdul Baha had so many disciples who were like this, and he loved them. There was a believer, now this is a believer, I never found his name, and we were told the story many times, but I failed to get the name from my father when he was telling us the story. But this person remains unnamed. But he was telling us the story that, when people went to see Baha'u'llah, usually you wrote, you said you're coming, you got permission, you then would arrive in Akka. Then the master, Abdul Baha, would arrange for you to stay in the pilgrim house for a few days, to rest, to settle down, to look at your clothes, to see if you had sufficient means. And then they would arrange for you to come into the presence of Baha'u'llah. But this man didn't know any of these things. He was such a simple soul. He started to travel from Yazd. He began the journey, and he walked all the way. He had nothing but a little bag on his shoulder. He was an elderly man, and he was going to see Baha'u'llah. He wanted to see his Lord. And he came to Akka, eventually. Somehow he found his way. And he began to ask people where he can see the house of Baha'u'llah is. And they showed him the house. So he comes in. And he finds there are some stairs. He goes up the stairs. There was nobody around at the time. But then he hears a lot of people in a room. You know, Baha'u'llah was in this room. He just goes near the door. He puts his head through the door, looks around, and he says, which one of you are Baha'u'llah? This Baha'u'llah. And Baha'u'llah embraces him, showers so much love upon him. And then he says, bring tea for him. He says, no, that's trouble. Don't get into trouble. And after a few minutes, after an hour sitting there, he says, well, I think I better go, and not to cause any more difficult troubles, I'll go. You know, this is how, nobody would ever leave the presence of Baha'u'llah unless he would dismiss them, this is how it was. But this man was a simple soul. And this is what matters, really. Simplicity in our soul and in our heart. And that cup of tea that you make with love and with simple heart and with devotion, that is much more fruitful than all the things some others may do in the faith. Well, now there are some questions here. Somebody says, is this person who is your wife is not with you, right? What? She'll be here. Oh, you're taping it?
Yeah.
All right. This is a question. He says, could you speak on the process of the lesser peace, the emergence of the faith from obscurity, and the completion of the ark on Mount Carmel, and how these are related? This is quite a vast thing. She wants to know everything. She really wants to know everything. Well, I chose this question because it's a good question, and it will probably give us a little picture of the faith in the future. This is more or less the subject that we were discussing at the Dublin Conference, International Conference. That, from the writings, and I have heard this is Pilgrim's Notes, but I have compared this Pilgrim Notes with the writings of Shoghi Effendi, and I found out that almost everything that is in this Pilgrim Notes, they are recorded in various parts of Shoghi Effendi's writings, that if you put them together, it'll tally with what Shoghi Effendi had said to this believer. There's only one or two things that I could not identify in the writings. And that is that, first of all, the lesser peace. As you know, the lesser peace, and this is not part of the Pilgrim Notes, I'll come back to it later. As you know, the lesser peace is a political peace. Baha'u'llah has said to Queen Victoria that if you, now that you have rejected the most great peace, which is spiritual, the establishment of his world order in the world, now that you have rejected it, at least you should adhere and bring about a lesser peace, so that wars could be abolished. Now you see, we were talking yesterday about the creativity of the word. Because Baha'u'llah said this, we shall have a lesser peace. And if we don't want to have a lesser peace, we will be forced to have a lesser peace. You see now how the word of God is effective? We will be forced. Because man will come eventually to a point of recognizing that if he takes one more step, the whole world is going to be destroyed. And he says, that's enough. So the lesser peace will come. It will come at a point that mankind has really exhausted itself. And then he has no choice but to accept what Baha'u'llah has said. Now, those of you who were here, I was talking the story of the egg. You remember? The egg and the opening of the egg. The cause of God is now, the institutions of the faith now are in obscurity. I'm talking of the institutions of the faith. People do not know what our institutions are for. No matter how much you try to explain what is a local spiritual assembly doing, the generality of mankind does not appreciate it. In fact, we ourselves, as we were talking yesterday, may not appreciate it fully, of what the significance and the importance of these institutions are, that these are going to be one day the basis of the government for mankind. I'm not saying it's going to be necessarily the government, but they are going to have a great share. Who knows how they will develop and what they will do, these houses of justice. No one can say how these houses of justice will fit in to the running of the world, the management of the affairs of the world, how our national assemblies will fit into it, how the governments will fit into it. We cannot say these things. Nobody can ever foresee how these things will emerge. And the only way that Shoghi Effendi has described it to us, when they asked him, tell us what the unfoldment of the administrative order is going to be like, how will it shape up? He says two things will enable us to understand the unfoldment of the administrative order of Baha'u'llah and the emergence of his world order. Two things. One, he said, is the passage of time. You have to wait, in other words. And the other is the guidance of the House of Justice. Now, this is exactly the same in nature. If you, as I said, everything we have in the faith, you can trace it to nature. Now, in nature, you will find that anything which has an organic growth, say for instance a tree, example of a tree. The tree, once you plant the seed, you cannot ever say what this tree is going to be like until you give it time. Passage of time will tell you what this tree is going to look like, how big it's going to be, how many branches will it have. And the other thing, this is one element, the passage of time. And the other one is the laws of nature, which must be allowed to run through this whole process, to run this process of growth and development. The laws of nature must be allowed to work through this tree. And through these two elements, we can know what this tree is going to be like. Exactly the same thing here is with the development of the administrative order. Two things, the passage of time and the guidance of the Universal House of Justice for centuries maybe to come. Then we know what the world order of Baha'u'llah is like, how it will manage the affairs of the world, how it will run the affairs of the world, how all these institutions will come together to form a complete, a coherent system which will govern mankind. But at the moment, the faith is the institutions of the faith, local and national and international. They are in obscurity, and mankind does not know what they are for. Now, the time appears from the writings. It appears from the writings that when Baha'u'llah says that when the limbs of mankind have quaked, when it has really trembled, when the old order has been crumbled down, he says, then and only then, you see, these are his own words, then and only then will the divine standard be unfurled. In other words, then and only then people will recognize what we are saying and what we are having, what we are building. They are going to see, just like when the egg breaks up and opens up, you're going to see the new life emerging. And then people can see a new life. But that new life is just born. The institutions just have emerged. Nobody can say that once a child is born, he can immediately manage, he can immediately act as a grown-up person. You have to wait time for it to grow. Centuries has to wait, maybe. When the world order of Baha'u'llah, when the institutions of the faith emerge, in the words of Shoghi Effendi, the evolvement, he says, the evolvement, you see in one of his letters, the evolvement of local and national institutions, when that takes place, and he mentions when it will take place, I will talk to you about it now in a minute, the evolvement of Baha'i local and national institutions of the faith, it is just an emergency. Just people will see it. They can see what potentialities there are in it. But it cannot immediately take over now the affairs of the world and begin to rule the world. The institutions of the faith cannot do that. We have to have an interim form of government in the world, which would then, from the lesser peace onwards, could then manage the affairs of the world. Until such time, that the world order of Baha'u'llah can then come in and take over gradually as time goes on. Now, Shoghi Effendi has given us a timing for this. In one of his letters he mentions that when the buildings on Mount Carmel, the building of the Ark, are completed and the world center of the faith begins to function, and which is quite a long way to go yet by the look of things. We have to build up more buildings, 3 more buildings, as you know. There are 2 buildings already built on the Ark, the Archives building and the building of the House of Justice around the Ark. But there should be 3 other buildings. One is for the study of the writings, which I understand will be built between the Archives and the House of Justice. And then the other 2 buildings, the International Teaching Center and the Public Library and the General Library, International Library. These 5 buildings then completed, and then the beautification of the gardens, the terraces to be made, the functioning of the world center of the faith, when they all begin to function. Shoghi Effendi says it will coincide with 2 things. One is the emergence of the lesser peace, and one is, as he puts it, the evolvement of both local and national institutions of the faith. Now, it is then that peoples of the world are able to at least appreciate, to some extent, what these institutions can do for the future of mankind. But as I said, it will take a long time for the world order of Baha'u'llah to come into being. Now, from here on, I'm going to describe this story of this pilgrim's note. And you must take, but as most of these points that I'm mentioning, or you can find it in the writings of Shoghi Effendi, here and there, put them together. You know that, now I'm not yet talking about that pilgrim's note. Let me give you a little bit more background to it. You know that the teachings of God, the social teachings of Baha'u'llah in this age, are such that the generality of mankind without being Baha'is, can and will put them into operation without knowing where they come from. This is the spirit of the age. And when this lesser peace is coming, Shoghi Effendi has said in this pilgrim's note again, which I haven't been able to identify, maybe our friend Ted can tell us if he's found anything, which he says that the lesser peace and the maturity of mankind are one and the same thing. The coming age of humanity, which Baha'u'llah refers to in his writings, and the lesser peace are one and the same thing. Now, I don't know. I haven't been able to find it in the writings, but this is the pilgrim's note. But from the signs, if you look at the signs of the coming of age of humanity, which Baha'u'llah has given us signs for it, you can believe this. You can accept this. Because Baha'u'llah have said in some of his tablets about the coming of age of humanity, a time that humanity will come of age, like a man who becomes 21. And he has given us 3 signs for it, Baha'u'llah. Now this is in the writings. One is the establishment of a universal language. So you see, this is not very far away. It's not something which you can say it's going to be hundreds of years, but it is something which is round the corner, you can say, because the man is needing it more and more. The other sign is that kingship, the institution of kingship, will be such a discredited institution. It will be so discredited that people do not want to take on the burden of kingship if you offer it to them even. Well, this has happened already. The discrediting of the institution of kingship. Kingship. Now, it does not mean that we Baha'is believe that there should be no kingship in the faith, in the future. In fact, this is one of the teachings of Baha'u'llah. He says God would prefer, God likes to see a system of kingship coming into being. rather than a system by which you have presidents. If it wasn't for kingship, you wouldn't have the word majesty, and you would not know what majesty is, and you would not know what the majesty of God is. And Baha'u'llah says we do not want people to be deprived of this. But this will be a democratic, or what, not democratic, constitutional kingship. Something which is very different from the kings which existed at the time of Baha'u'llah. Constitutional kingship. Who knows? I have again heard this. I don't like to repeat Pilgrim's Notes, but we have heard that Shoghi Effendi has said every country in the world will have a king, including the United States of America. So watch for yourselves here. Now, the institution of kingship, whatever happens, will become eventually part of the world order of Baha'u'llah, because you cannot have anything in the future but the world order of Baha'u'llah, which will have a system, which will be a system by which the whole world will combine all its resources and its institutions together, and how they will emerge we do not know. So now, the second sign, as I said, that Baha'u'llah gives for the coming of age of humanity is that the institution of kingship will be discredited so much that people do not want to take the burden on. This has happened. And the third sign, which also has happened and has taken place already, on a smaller scale, but anyhow it has taken place, is that the alchemy, he says, will become an achieved, alchemy will be achieved. That is the transmutation of copper into gold, of any metal, the transmutation, the changing of elements. Well, now this has already taken place in the atomic laboratories, and you can do this through the process of processes of the atomic physics. But it is so expensive that if you change them, it's going to be very expensive. I read some time ago in the newspapers, years ago, that one of the nations, Russians, have said that they can produce gold, or they will produce gold, which would be cheaper than what is in the market. Now, again, this is an indication, this alchemy. By the way, when alchemy has been one of those things that all the early men of knowledge and science of those days, from the early days of Islam, they have been working on it. Many people, actually the word alchemy, the word chemist is an Arabic word, alchemy, kimia, it's from kimia, which is an Arabic word. And but during Baha'u'llah's lifetime also, many of his disciples during his lifetime were involving themselves in this act of producing, of testing and experimenting. And Baha'u'llah stopped them. He said, this is not the time for it. He told them to stop this. And he said, when the time comes, it will be discovered. And he said, when it will be discovered, we have a tablet of Baha'u'llah which is very striking. He says, when it is discovered, mankind will discover a force which can destroy the whole world. And he prays that God will not, and this is, as I said, associated with the discovery of the atomic energy. So now, you see, these are the signs of the coming of age of humanity. And in this Pilgrim's Note, we heard Shoghi Effendi said that the lesser peace and the coming of age of humanity is the same thing, which from the signs that I mentioned to you, it's very likely. Now, all the other things that he has spoken about it is very beautiful, and you can find it in the writings. He says you can divide, in order to study the progress of the world in the future, you can first divorce the faith from it, and let us examine the non-Baha'i world after the lesser peace to see what processes and what stages it will go through, the non-Baha'i world. First of all the social teachings of Baha'u'llah Now forget about the Baha'i faith and the influence of the Baha'i faith. Forget about that. But look at the non-Baha'i world. Let us have the branch of humanity, which is non-Baha'i branch. The non-Baha'i branch will go through so many stages of development and progress, using all the social teachings of Baha'u'llah, such as equality of men and women, establishment of a universal language, establishment of a world government, the making of one weight currency and measures, the federation of nations. All of these things will take place, the social teachings of Baha'u'llah. Education for all, the tapping of the resources of the world equitably. And these things will happen without necessarily knowing that these are from Baha'u'llah. But these are the social teachings which will be carried out. And as a result of it, he says, a great blessing will come upon mankind. Wars are abolished, and the blessing which will bring with it is that of social and economic and scientific developments that mankind will make, in such a way that the planet will become like one country, literally, like a federation of nations. Like here in the United States, you have federations of nations, of states, but really they are one country. And this will become the world, and that we become so used to mixing together and rubbing shoulders with all kinds of peoples of all nationalities and peoples, that it's just like living in one country from the point of view of social and economic and other developments. Now then he says that looking in this branch of humanity, which is now devoid of the faith, and the faith has nothing to do with it at the moment, directly, he says that religions lose their influence more and more. And they cannot influence humanity. The soul of people will be starving for spiritual food. Although they are progressing socially, economically, politically, but spiritually, they will be in starvation, a spiritual starvation. And therefore there would be a great deal of delinquency, maybe. People have plenty of things to, plenty pleasures and plenty of food, plenty of comfort, security. And this will bring about, and the starvation of spiritual food, it's a terrible effect on the soul of man. The soul of man will be in a very depressed position in this particular branch of humanity. And then he says, now let us look at the faith and what the faith does. The other branch will go through stages. These are all written down by Shoghi Effendi now. You know, these things that I'm saying, it's not really Pilgrim's Notes. As I said, these are all can be verified in the writings. So the faith will go through different stages. The first is the stage of obscurity. And we are in obscurity in some parts of the world. But in some countries, of course, we are not in obscurity. It doesn't come together at the same time all over the world. One country, for instance, Persia, came out of obscurity in the first year of the coming of the Bab. The faith is not in obscurity. Everyone knows what the faith is. They all know it's part of their language, it's part of their vocabulary. And then after that stage of obscurity, it will become emancipated and from the religious orthodoxy. And then it will become known as a world religion. It will emerge as a world religion. And then it will grow through these stages, which we don't want to go into all in details, but eventually it comes to a point where in a country, the majority of the people in a country become Baha'i. And that is the stage of sovereignty for the faith. And this lady who was the pilgrim asked, what is majority? And Shoghi Effendi said 51%. When majority of the people of a country become Baha'i, then then the Baha'i government comes into being in that country. And the laws of Baha'u'llah can function. The laws of the Kitab-e-Aqdas then can function. And Shoghi Effendi had said in this particular note that it is expected of the minority then to obey the government of the majority in the same way that we now obey the governments we live in under. But of course, the Baha'i government will honor the religious aspirations of the people and will give them every freedom to exercise their religious laws and teachings. And then if you go further in this particular branch of the Baha'i branch, you will find that more governments will become Baha'i governments, one after the other. I mentioned yesterday that really and truly you people should aim at making this country the first Baha'i government. And really we must not think at it in a unbelieving way, but rather believing that they will come, that we will have Baha'i governments. Now then you will have the second Baha'i government and the third Baha'i government and so on and so forth. But then you see humanity is one. You can't divide it into two branches. Although we said for the sake of studying, we are having one branch, we call it non-Baha'i, and one branch we call it Baha'i, but humanity is one. And so more and more of these two processes will merge together as time goes on, merging together. People become Baha'i. Baha'i states come into being until such time that the majority of the nations in the world become Baha'i. It is then that these two processes that we have been analyzing in this way, these two processes completely merge together and meet together at the top. And he says as a result of this merging together, a child will be born. And that is the child of Baha'i civilization. And he says that is synonymous. That is synonymous with the establishment of the most great peace. And it is synonymous with the birth of the world order of Baha'u'llah. And it is synonymous with the establishment of the kingdom of God on earth. And mankind will celebrate that day in the name of Baha'u'llah, the Father, who has brought this kingdom. And then that child of Baha'i civilization which is born will it takes ages and centuries and thousands and thousands of years, 500,000 years, for the manifestations of God to come and enable that child of Baha'i civilization to grow into perfection. Just like a child grows into an adult. And how the emphasis will be on nobility of man. That man will become noble. Now this is the vision of the future for us Baha'is. Now we are in the darkest period of the history of man, the darkest period, and it's closing in on us day by day, and coming to the point of completely sundering everything which belongs to the old days, the old order. We talked about it yesterday, how much we Baha'is should be confident, absolutely confident, that we are going to be here to bring the message of Baha'u'llah to masses of peoples after the destruction of the world and all that is therein. This is our function. This is why He has created us. We are created for this purpose. The peoples of the world do not know.
When does the universal persecution, the worldwide persecution that Abdul-Baha describes, where and when
Okay. All right. We cannot now. All right. We cannot now ever doubt the power of Baha'u'llah, which is invested in his institutions, the power which he has got in it. Just as much as yesterday we were talking about the new life which comes out of the egg. The chicken coming out of the egg is the only thing which has got the power to stand on its own feet and to become the living organ of a new world. We must have faith in this. And we must prepare ourselves for the day that we are going to be there to bring great numbers into the faith. As Shoghi Effendi says, these institutions we are building becomes beacons of light to guide humanity at the time of its greatest peril. We are not worried about ourselves as to try to, we must never think of ourselves, oh, I want to protect myself. Well, you're all right, you will be protected. I can assure you will be protected. Well, if you want to take any actions, do. Nobody will stop you. But you know, a time will come that we will be guided when the guidance is needed. We will be guided as what to do. We will be guided by the House of Justice. And if they are not in contact with us because communications will be cut off, time will come that we will not be able to communicate with them. Our institutions today, which are very weak, and we were talking about them yesterday, these very weak and insignificant institutions, which we think they are insignificant outwardly, these institutions will be so inspired, our national assemblies will be so inspired as to tell the friends what to do, where to go to protect themselves. It will come. This is already happening in some countries where there is a great deal of wars and dangers facing people. These institutions will be guided by Baha'u'llah because there is the spirit of life in them. The spirit of the cause is within them. It's pulsating within them. Although they may be weak. Yesterday, you remember we talked of the ministry of Baha'u'llah during the years that he lived in that mansion. Almost half of his ministry in Akka was spent in this building. It's really the climax of his revelation when God really ascended upon his throne. This is the throne in some of his writings referred to is the throne of the there is this building, the throne of God. And in the traditions it's very clear that when God sits on his throne, all the messengers and the concourse on high circumambulate it. You can see in the writings too. Well, these two people wanted to circumambulate now this throne of their Lord. And when they went close to near the mansion, near the walls of the mansion, they found that 4 sides of the mansion is packed with people. Now they were not imagining things. They were not psychic people. They were very clear-headed. And they of course knew there's nobody from Akka. There's not one soul has left Akka at the time. There's nobody. There was none of these people. 4 sides. And they were filled with such awe. You can imagine the awe of that particular occasion must have been tremendous. That they couldn't go close. And they realized that to them this is really what their outer eyes could see. It was nothing but the souls of the manifestations of God and the concourse on high circumambulating the throne of their Lord. And so they went back, and then they circumambulated from long distance away in great awe and wonder, of having seen this. And he says that our shoes were filled with mud, and the whole area was wet, and all the mud that they went through. And then they quickly left for Akka. And they arrived just in time that they were closing the doors, the gates of the city. People of the East, that when something very, very important happens, they won't sleep that night. For instance, when you look at the passing of Baha'u'llah, when Baha'u'llah passed away, the friends don't sleep that night. They stay up in his memory and they say prayers. The same thing happens to the time of Abdul Baha passing. Now, Nabil said to my father, he said, tonight we must not sleep. We must stay awake. And Nabil was a man who used to drink a lot of tea. And he said to my father, he said, you make tea and I will write poems about this whole episode. And so that night, Nabil wrote the whole story of this in poetry. You know, many of Nabil's notes, Nabil, the historian of the faith, many of his notes are in poetry. You must not think that the first section of the Dawnbreakers, which Shoghi Effendi has edited for us, is exactly what Nabil has written it in this form. This is edited by Shoghi Effendi. Some of these notes are in different forms. He had put them together and produced it. And the rest of his memoirs and notes, which deal with the history of Baha'u'llah, which are not published yet, they are also, some of them, in this form. So that night he wrote this, the whole story of what had happened. And in the morning, the two of them sent to Baha'u'llah this poem of Nabil. And they also sent him, you know, in those days it was customary for the believers to send gifts to Baha'u'llah. Just like you give a box of chocolates now. In those days, the very popular thing was a sugar cone. You may not have seen what a sugar cone is like. In those days, sugar were made in the form of a cone, big cones, and then you break them for your tea and other uses. So they sent 2 of these as a gift to Baha'u'llah. And Baha'u'llah wrote a tablet. We don't have this tablet because maybe this was with Nabil's things. We haven't found it yet. And in this tablet, Baha'u'llah accepts their pilgrimage at a time that all the concourse on high were circumambulating the throne of their Lord. And he gives a new name to each one of them. Now, as I said, don't go along and tell the stories because it's bound to become it'll change in his career. I've heard people saying this because Shoghi Effendi used to tell this story to some of the pilgrims. And the pilgrims would come and say this story to an audience like this. And then I have heard myself that some other people have been saying this story, and when you say, how did he hear it? He heard it 2 or 3 steps away, which meant that it was so changed that it had a bare resemblance to what I was telling you now. So here we are. You asked me to tell you the story. Now I feel that we better deal with some of these questions which are in here. Or what would you like me to do? Anybody has a question now? Yeah?
As you know,
The what? To do what? I don't know. Maybe they do. Yes? Yes? Well, that's all these things. I suppose we are free to think in these terms if you want to do that. I don't know some of the answers, really. Well, let me... Yes?
Would you please speak to us a little bit about fear of God?
Oh, fear of God. Gosh, you're all going to be frightened, huh? No. I think it's a good point. Actually, somebody has asked this question. Baha'u'llah has mentioned in many of his writings that the fear of God is what we have to, all of us, feel. And that he says, not until you have that fear of God in your hearts will you be able to progress. Now, you can read in the gleanings. I don't have it in here. In fact, if you had the gleanings here, we could find it for you and read it, those passages. But anyhow, we can read it later on, maybe. You can read it later on at some stage. He says this is the way in which man can progress spiritually. Now, we must remember here that fear of God. God is loving. God is just. God is full of bounties. Now, why can we fear him? How should we fear him? First of all, let me mention this, because I said God has bounties and has justice. Do you know that it is through the bounty of God that we have come into being, not through his justice? It's a very important point to remember. It's not through the justice of God that man is created. And it is not also through the justice of God that divine revelations are sent. It's through the bounty of God. Now, Baha'u'llah has mentioned that if ever the justice of God comes into being, the whole creation will cease to exist. You see now? I'll explain to you. If you have got some money in your pocket, and if you go to a shop, it is only just that the shopkeeper should give you something equal to your money. It's justice. You give him the money, he gives you the goods. This is justice. But what would you do if you went to a shop and you had no money at all, and the man gave you a lot of things? This is not justice. This is bounty. Now, Baha'u'llah says, look at yourself and see what you are. He says, you are a handful of dust. You're made from the dust. And the dust is the most worthless things you can find in this creation. It's the lowest kingdom. You're made of dust. And he says, you had nothing. And he says, look what I gave you. I gave you the most precious entity in creation, and that is the soul. But you had nothing. So you see, creation comes into being purely through the bounty of God. If it was through its justice, we did not deserve anything, because we were dust. You see? This is a very significant point that he mentions. So the bounties of God is the cause of progress and development spiritually. If ever the justice comes into being, as he says, the creation will not exist, cannot exist. Disintegrates immediately, finishes. Now God, therefore, through his creation, he has brought about his bounties for us. And I mentioned yesterday how the forgiveness of God, that how much the forgiveness of God plays a role in life, not in this life, but also in the next life. That is to say that through his forgiveness, all people will progress. Every person will progress in the spiritual worlds of God. We do not believe in eternal damnation. Every soul will grow. Even those who have had a terrible life here, who knows how God will deal with them? We don't know. We cannot here judge and say, oh no, this man is going to be treated this way or that way. Who knows? Baha'u'llah mentions one of his greatest enemies, who was the ambassador, Turkish ambassador, the Persian ambassador in Turkey, who was a great enemy of Baha'u'llah, who did so much to hurt him, Baha'u'llah says God may forgive him because one of his relatives is a believer. You see? Who knows how God acts? So that there is no limit to God's love and mercy and forgiveness. But now let us examine fear of God. Fear comes to us when we are not able to cope with the situation. Now, isn't that right? Now, I'll give you an example of this. Say you are working in your office, or you're a student in a school. If you're a student, if you have not done your work in school, when the day of examination comes, you will be filled with fear. Not that the teacher frightens you, but that you are fearful because of your inadequacy, that you haven't done what you are supposed to do. If your boss, if your superior, or whoever you work for asks you to do something and you don't do it, you are filled with fear. This is how fear comes to us. It's because we are inadequate. We haven't done our job. Now let us put ourselves in position of coming face to face in the next life with God or whatever it is. I'm sure we won't see the essence of God, but shall we say with the manifestation of God, with Baha'u'llah, face to face with Him. Now I can have two conditions. Either I'm satisfied that everything He has asked me to do, I have done it absolute perfection, so I have no fear. Right? Now, that's the answer to it. Or, if I haven't done anything at all, I would be very fearful. There is another alternative if I'm not fearful. Maybe I'm not fearful because I don't think these things will happen in the next life. Maybe Baha'u'llah will never come face to face to me. Maybe He never asked me, why did you do this or that? But this is not true. We know that we will have to give account of everything. You see, Baha'u'llah mentions that. He says, keep your account every day before you are asked to give your account before God. So fear comes not because God is a fearful figure, that you are frightened of Him. But fear comes to us because we are inadequate. We look at our shortcomings. And then when you are going to really face Him, when you really realize, now this is the time, now I'm going to face Him, the fear of God is engendered in one's heart. This is really what it is, the fear of God. It's because we are conscious of our shortcomings. And then when you realize that what you had to do. Now I tell you, I had once an experience, and I'll share it with you. It's a personal experience, but I share it with you. You know how it is every time we have a problem in life, personal problem or any problem, we immediately go to God and pray to Him. As soon as you have a problem, you just take the prayer book and you sit down and you pray, the remover of difficulties and all the others that we are familiar with. Well, one day I was doing the same thing. And suddenly, now I can tell you there, really and truly, suddenly I saw Baha'u'llah, as if I saw Him in front of my eyes saying to me something. And you know what He said to me? Quite frankly, I got it very clear. He said, shame on you. This is what He said. Shame on you. Every time you have a problem, you come to me. Really? But did you ever come once to me and say, oh please help me to teach your faith, help me to serve your faith, I am longing to do something for you? No. You only come to me when you have a problem. Shame. Now I really stopped praying. I just stopped it. Couldn't say anything. And it came to me like a thunderbolt. Now you know it's like this. And it became very clear that it was like this, that you have a very good friend Say you have a very, very good friend, one of your best friends, a very influential friend, a very best friend that you have, that you give your life for him. And he lives, say, in another country. And he writes to you and he says, look, I want you to do something for me in here. I can't be in your country, but I want you to go to this shop and buy this and that for me. What would you do as soon as he writes to you? You immediately go and get it for him. He says, you are the only one who can do it. Go and get it for me. But what happens if I don't do it? I won't do it today, I won't do it tomorrow, I won't do it the next month, and the next month, and the next month, and the next year. I will never go to get this thing that my friend wants me to get for him. But then every time I need something, I'll go to him. And I expect him immediately to answer it. Now you see, this is exactly the situation. So that really when we think and we find that we have so much to do, and this life is so short. So much to do for Baha'u'llah. He has asked us to teach his faith. Now that's what I said, shame on me. That was the answer. I don't do it. And instead I go to him for all my problems. And then, when the real time comes, really, if Baha'u'llah would come and say to you, what have you done now in your life? Let us examine it. What have you got? What is the result of your whole life? What have you done? Well, this is where the fear comes. Because one is not adequate. But you know, there is one thing we must remember. Again, remember the forgiveness of God. Once you fear him, yes, then naturally one fear him. One fear that one hasn't done what he is supposed to do. But also remember the bounties, the love of your Lord. You know, our life is like this glass. You see, this glass of water here. Every service that we render is like a drop of water that you put in this. And at the end of a lifetime, all that you have is the result of your life. Here, you present it. This is what you have. That's what you take with us. That's what we take with us into the next life. We talked about it the first day. Remember, we said we can only take good things into the next life. And all our deeds is like this perfect water that we are taking with us. Drop by drop. We serve today, we serve tomorrow, and this adds together, accumulates together. But a little bit of impurities, then it will make the whole glass to become adulterated. A little bit of self, a little bit of ambition. These are the things will really destroy our services to the faith. There may be a man who has served an awful lot in this life. There have been some people like this. Served enormously, very on a great high scale. But at the end, they did something which destroyed it altogether. And so the cup of water, instead of being pure, it is adulterated. But there is one remedy which we can still have, and this is again a marvelous thing that we have this remedy. You know, have you seen in chemistry, there are some, if you have something, for instance, colorful, dirty, you just drop one little chemical into it, it'll purifies it, cleanse it immediately. And this is the same thing here in our deeds, in our life. We can cleanse our deeds and our actions with servitude, becoming a servant really, becoming selfless. That is like this chemical which will purify all the wrong things that one has done. And God will come to you then in great measures. This is why Baha'u'llah says, how many a person who has lived the life of service, and at the end, just at the end, when he is going to go, he does something which will ruin his whole life. All his services are gone. And how many a person who has lived a terrible life, and just at the time of his passing, through one deed, through the carrying out of one action, just like this chemical that I say you drop into this water, he will become completely absolved of all the wrong things he had done. And that's why he says, no one knows what his end shall be.